In the past 50 years, two things have been simultaneously happening to the middle class. On one hand, goods have gotten cheaper, people have been accumulating more, and from the outside it looks like the middle class is thriving. But on the other hand, wages have stagnated, jobs have been getting worse, and the middle class is struggling financially. And call me crazy, but I think that these two things are related. I think that cheap shit is killing the middle class. Cheap shit has replaced stability. Our abundant access to low-cost goods has opened this Pandora's box that the middle class has ultimately been paying the price. And in this video, I want to explain how. Because believe it or not, once upon a time in this country, America had a thriving middle class that was a result of decades of intentional decisions to lift up the ordinary worker. However, decades after, that progress was stripped away, and now we're left with a middle class that looks very rich on the outside, but is very poor on the inside. And so in order to understand how cheap shit killed the middle class, we need to go back in time to when America had no middle class at all. Chapter 1, America before the middle class. Until about 80 years ago, America did not have a middle class. America as a nation was wealthy, but Americans as individuals were not. You see, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, society was split into two extremes. A very small, very wealthy industrial elite at the top controlled entire industries, and a massive, struggling working class at the bottom worked for them. There was no middle. You were either doing great or really struggling. And if you were at the bottom like most people were, life was brutal. You worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week with dangerous machinery, made low-wage jobs were unstable, and upward mobility was near impossible. Furthermore, in this nation of extremes, the government favored businesses over individuals, and so workers, ordinary people, didn't have many rights. No Social Security, no unemployment benefits, no health insurance, no workers' protection, and no sick days. The worker wasn't valued. Meanwhile, at the top, life looked very different. The industrial elite got rich off the backs of the workers they exploited, and some historians estimate by the late 1920s, 84% of household wealth in the US was held by the top 10%. And because wealth was so concentrated at the top, consumption was a privilege that was reserved mostly for the wealthy elite. Ordinary workers lived in crowded housing, owned very few possessions, and stretched every dollar just to survive. Meanwhile, the wealthy enjoyed imported goods, fine clothing, and luxuries that most Americans couldn't imagine. But the system of extremes couldn't last forever. By 1929, it all came crashing down during the Great Depression and exposed that everyday Americans were barely surviving, workers had no social safety net, and the economy was far more fragile than anyone realized. And that would set the stage for America to engineer something extraordinary. Chapter 2, The Engineering of the Middle Class. After the Great Depression, America was forced to build itself from the ground up. But this time, unlike before, America set out to build a more equitable system that supported all Americans, not just a handful of wealthy elite. And it all started in 1932, when FDR passed a series of reforms to protect the worker: unemployment insurance, Social Security, labor protections, the right to unionize, federal minimum wage, and banking regulations. These reforms didn't create the middle class, but they laid the foundation that a middle class needs to thrive: stability. And while these reforms built stability, it wasn't until World War II, until the true conditions appeared for the middle class to grow in America. Jobs were in abundance, wages increased, and women and minorities were earning a consistent paycheck for the first time. The worker was starting to become valued, and the middle class was taking off. And as the war ended, the government passed another series of reforms to help engineer a strong middle class. In 1944, the government passed the GI Bill, which gave ordinary people access to free college and job training, business loans, and home loans. And as ordinary people were starting to have options for the first time, those options gave them leverage to demand even more. In 1954, 1 out of 3 workers were in a union that negotiated pay scales for upward mobility, benefits packages, and protected workers. And with this stability, ordinary people started to have disposable income. And with that, a culture of consumer spending was born where ordinary people could afford to buy better clothes, cars, and appliances. And this type of spending exposed something remarkable. When people have good paying jobs, they could afford to buy goods, which would then fuel the economy and create more jobs. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the middle class didn't appear by accident, but it was carefully engineered by policy, protected by unions, empowered by stable, well-paying jobs. But this system only worked as long as America remained the dominant producer of the world, and by the late 60s, that was starting to change. Chapter 3, America's New Addiction. For the 2 decades following World War II, America lived in a perfectly balanced closed loop. Americans worked American jobs, earned American wages, and used that wage to buy American goods, fueling the need for even more American jobs. But by the late 60s, that loop was starting to break. Countries like Japan and Germany were now entering the American market competing against American goods. Suddenly, American companies were competing against entire nations that could produce goods cheaper, more efficiently, and better quality than American goods. Japan was importing small fuel-efficient cars to compete against gas-guzzling American cars. Technology was cheaper and higher quality, and innovation was moving quicker, making American consumers flock to these foreign, cheaper goods. Americans started to get addicted to cheaper, high-quality goods from abroad, and this addiction came at a cost as American manufacturing started to slow down. Companies started to lay off workers, push for automation, and outsource production to stay afloat. And as American businesses were struggling to compete, in response, they were starting to rethink their entire business model. Chapter 4, America's New Business Model. Up to this point in the story, American companies largely saw their employees as investments, people worth paying well, protecting, and keeping long term. However, when global competition intensified, workers started to be seen as costs that needed to be reduced. Compared to the global market producing cheaper goods, American-made products couldn't match the lower wages, faster innovation, and cheaper production costs that came from overseas. And as America was losing ground to foreign competition, came a new business model called shareholder value, which is the idea that a company's primary responsibility was to increase the profits to its shareholders. And in this new philosophy, workers were starting to be seen as a liability, not an asset. And companies began outsourcing jobs overseas, reducing benefits packages, and getting rid of lifelong employment to make goods cheaper and in abundance. And those decisions had a consequence that no one really understood at the time. The jobs that once built a strong middle class were now being replaced by completely different jobs. Chapter 5, The Service Economy. As factories closed and jobs were shipped overseas, the American economy started to look very different. We moved from a nation that makes things for ourselves and others to a nation that buys cheaper things from other countries. And this shift came with a fundamental change on how the American economy worked. Production was no longer the engine of growth, but consumption was. And corporations didn't need millions of highly skilled factory workers to build quality products, but they needed millions of cashiers, salespeople, and customer service reps to sell cheap goods. Cheap goods needed cheap labor, and the service economy delivered just that. And throughout the 90s and 2000s, companies like Walmart, Target, and Sears became some of the country's largest employers, making record profits selling cheap disposable goods. However, these new service jobs didn't create stability like the old manufacturing jobs did. They paid less, offered fewer benefits, less social mobility, and provided almost no long-term security. They started to squeeze the middle class, but what the strange part was is as jobs got worse, life started to look better on the outside. Because although people's wages were getting crunched, goods were getting cheaper, creating the illusion that the middle class was still doing good. However, the truth is it wasn't just cheap goods that created this illusion, but it was cheap money. Cheap money became the new thing that was holding up the foundation of the middle class. Chapter 6, Propping Up the Middle Class. At this point in our story, Americans have gotten used to the middle class consumerist lifestyle. However, with job security on the decline due to the service economy, throughout the 80s and 90s, there started to be this gap between the lifestyle Americans wanted and the lifestyle they could afford, and debt became the way to fill that gap. Consumer debt was around long before the decline of the middle class, but it really became more popular and more mainstream in the 80s because borrowing became easier, cheaper, faster, and more profitable for banks than ever. And in 1978, a single Supreme Court case called Marquette versus First of Omaha allowed banks to charge whatever interest rates were legal in the state they were based in, not where consumers lived. So almost overnight, major banks flocked to states with no interest caps, and credit cards became extremely profitable for banks. And throughout the 80s, credit cards went from being this niche convenience to an everyday lifeline to help you get gas, get food, buy clothes, and even daily necessities. And over time, cheap money became woven into every aspect of life, propping up the middle class. You borrowed to go to school, to buy a car, a home, to cover emergencies, to just stay in the middle class. As wages stagnated, more households became reliant on cheap money to prop up their lifestyle that an old stable job could afford. Debt became the thing that was propping up the middle class, but underneath, the foundation of the middle class was crumbling. Chapter 7, The False Middle Class. By the time credit became a normal part of American life, something unusual was happening. From the outside, the middle class looked strong. People had cars, homes, and stuff. But from the inside, savings were shrinking, debt was rising, and jobs were getting worse. The middle class was starting to become this illusion that was being propped up by debt, but no one really seemed to care because culturally, being in the middle class was no longer this financial thing, but it was this visual thing. The middle class wasn't defined by having stability and financial security, but it was defined by having access to financing and borrowing money for everything. And at least in the beginning, this illusion seemed good for the economy. Banks profited from interest, retailers profited from constant consumption, and even the government was benefiting from GDP growth. But underneath this, the middle class was more broke and vulnerable than ever. But illusions never last forever. Debt has its limits. Savings are important. And eventually, with all things in life, the bill eventually becomes due. Chapter 8, When the Bill Finally Came Due. By the time we enter the 2000s, America transformed into a cheap nation. Cheap goods, cheap credit, cheap labor, and cheap expectations. And it all worked great until, well, it didn't. Because the truth is, you can't build a stable middle class on cheapness. You can't expect stability from mediocre jobs, a lifestyle funded by debt, and no financial security. It's just a ticking time bomb, one spark away from disaster. And throughout the last 25 years, we have seen how vulnerable the American middle class really is. Whether that was through the dot-com bust, the housing crash, or the pandemic, one bad event is all it takes to turn people's lives upside down. And the thing about these events is that these events aren't the thing that are breaking the middle class, but they're just exposing how fragile the middle class is. They're exposing how trapped many people are. Trapped in jobs that don't allow them to get ahead. Trapped in debt that never seems to go down. Trapped in a lifestyle they can't afford. Because for decades, the things that provided stability for the middle class have been stripped away and replaced by cheaper alternatives. We traded good jobs for cheap labor. We traded long-term sustainability for short-term growth. And we traded a strong middle class for the appearance of one. Cheap shit didn't just give us lower prices, but it stripped away the foundation that held up the middle class, and that is the price we pay for cheap shit. And so I want to finish this video off with chapter 9. Where do we go from here? Alright, another deep dive story in the books. In this video, we have seen the middle class rise through policy, leverage, and dominance, and we've seen it fall through global competition, cutting costs, and decades of cheap substitutions. And so, as always, I would like to finish this video off with 3 takeaways that I personally learned from making this video. 1. Everything has unseen costs. Since making these historical video essays over the last 3 months, it's really challenged me to think critically about my own society, and it made me realize that everything in this world comes with costs you don't see. You might get a cheap shelf from Amazon, but it comes at the cost of factories shutting down. You might get cheap shipping, but it comes at the cost of workers being pushed to their limits. And you might get cheap credit, but it comes at the cost of families drowning in debt. On the surface, cheap makes life easier, but someone somewhere ultimately has to pay the price for those goods. 2. The middle class doesn't happen on its own. I think if there's one thing this story teaches us, it is that the American middle class didn't naturally appear on its own, but it came from decades of fighting, reforms, and beliefs. It was created intentionally by people who decided that ordinary Americans deserved a stable life. And finally, it's a big club and you ain't in it. The most interesting part of this story to me was the first chapter, America Before a Middle Class. How these extremely rich industrial elite got their wealth off the backs of the workers they exploited. And what's so interesting is no matter what time period you live in, we always end up idolizing these people. We treat them like visionaries, geniuses, and heroes. But the truth is these people don't care about you. They're just looking out after their interests, not the greater good for society. As George Carlin once said,
"It's a big club, and you ain't in it. You and I are not in the big club."
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe for more. I love to hear your thoughts down in the comments section. And if you want to hear another very interesting story about how healthcare is squeezing the boomers in their retirement, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tengan un buen día. Nos vemos, chicos.